Hello everyone, and welcome back to Dr. Creepy. Tonight we're heading deep into the endless forests, remote mountain corridors, and long-forgotten sections of the Appalachian Trail to bring you 9 most disturbing Appalachian Trail horror stories ever shared. From hikers who vanished between shelters without a trace, to footsteps circling tents where no tracks should exist, to voices calling from the tree line using names no stranger should know, these encounters happened far from towns, far from cell service, and far from help, where the trail stops feeling like a path and starts feeling aware. If you're new here, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon for more true horror stories. Now get comfortable, and let's start. I had been on the Appalachian Trail for just over 3 weeks when I realized how quiet it could get in ways I had never experienced before. Not the normal quiet hikers talk about, where the birds fade and the wind settles. This was different. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breathing, of the scrape of fabric when you shifted your shoulders under your pack, of the soft thud of your boots hitting dirt that had been walked smooth by decades of footsteps. I had hiked alone before, plenty of times, but something about that stretch of trail felt heavier, like the woods were closer than they should have been. I was heading northbound through a section that didn't get much attention compared to the more scenic parts. No overlooks, no dramatic ridgelines, just long corridors of trees and shallow valleys where fog lingered even in the afternoon. I had planned it that way. I liked the quieter sections. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and usually that meant fewer problems. That assumption would turn out to be wrong. The first thing that stood out was the shelter register. I stopped there late in the afternoon, mostly to rest my knees and refill water from the nearby spring. I wasn't planning to stay the night, but I flipped through the logbook out of habit. Most entries were normal. Names, trail names, weather complaints, comments about sore feet. Then I noticed something odd. Several entries over the past week mentioned hearing someone walking around the shelter at night, slow footsteps that stopped whenever someone turned on a headlamp. No one sounded panicked, just unsettled. One hiker had written that they assumed it was wildlife until they realized the steps were paced, deliberate, and always upright. I remember shrugging it off. On a long trail, small worries get amplified. People hear things, misinterpret sounds. I signed my name, closed the book, and moved on. By early evening, the light was already starting to fade. The canopy in that area was thick, and the trail dipped into a shallow ravine where the sun seemed to disappear faster than it should have. I was still a few miles from my planned campsite, but I wasn't worried. I had enough daylight, and the trail was well marked. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. At first, I assumed another hiker had caught up. It wasn't uncommon for people to leapfrog each other over a few days. I stepped aside at a wider section of trail and waited, expecting someone to pass. The sound stopped. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. After a few seconds, I started walking again, and within moments the footsteps resumed, matching my pace almost exactly. I slowed down, they slowed down, I stopped completely. The footsteps took one more step and then stopped as well. I called out, asking who it was. No answer. I waited, expecting maybe an apology, maybe laughter, maybe someone embarrassed about scaring me. Instead, the woods stayed silent. I told myself it was nothing. Sound carries strangely in the mountains. I started walking again, more alert now, glancing over my shoulder more often than I liked to admit. The footsteps didn't return, but the feeling of being followed stayed with me, like an itch between my shoulder blades. By the time I reached my campsite, dusk had settled in fully. It was an unofficial spot, the kind hikers pass down through word of mouth. Flat ground, sheltered from wind, close enough to water. I set up quickly, more eager than usual to get my headlamp on and my routine done. Cooking helped steady my nerves. Familiar motions always did. That night I slept lightly. Every small sound pulled me half awake. Sometime after midnight, I heard movement outside my tent. Not loud, not crashing through brush, just the careful sound of something stepping around the perimeter. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled once, slow and steady, then stopped near the back of my tent. I expected to hear breathing or fabric rustling or the snap of a branch. Instead, there was nothing. After a long minute, the steps resumed, moving away, fading into the forest. I stayed awake until dawn. In the morning, I found footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints, clear and deep in the damp soil. They circled my campsite exactly once, stopping just behind where my head had been. I checked my own boots, hoping somehow they matched. They didn't. Different tread, different size. Someone had been there. Close. I packed up and left early, telling myself it was just another hiker with poor boundaries. It was unsettling, but not dangerous. At least that's what I kept repeating. The trail that day wound through a series of low ridges, never climbing high enough to offer views, never descending far enough to feel open. It felt like walking through a tunnel made of trees. Around midday, I passed a man heading southbound. He was older, late 50s maybe, with a thick beard and eyes that seemed tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. We exchanged the usual greetings, but as I moved past him, he asked where I had slept the night before. When I told him the area, his expression changed slightly. Not alarm, but concern. He said he had heard stories about someone lingering in that section, someone who followed hikers but never stayed in shelters. I asked if he thought it was dangerous. He shrugged and said, "Depends what you mean by dangerous." That answer stayed with me. Later that afternoon, I reached another shelter. I debated staying there despite my original plan. The thought of other people nearby was comforting. There were already 3 hikers there when I arrived. We talked as we cooked dinner, swapping trail stories, laughing about gear failures and bad weather. None of them mentioned anything strange, but when I brought up the footprints, one of them went quiet. He said he had heard someone walking around his tent 2 nights earlier in the same general area. That night, we all slept in the shelter. Sometime before dawn, I woke to the sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. Slow, deliberate steps. I assumed one of the others was getting up early. I didn't open my eyes right away. The steps moved back and forth, pausing at each sleeping spot. When they reached mine, they stopped. I opened my eyes. There was no one there. The steps continued, moving away, exiting the shelter. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened as the door creaked softly and closed. No one else stirred. In the morning, when I asked if anyone had been up early, all 3 said no. We checked the area around the shelter. No footprints. The ground was dry and hard-packed, offering no clues. I left with one of the hikers later that morning. We planned to stick together for a few miles, at least until the trail crossed a road. Having someone else nearby helped, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. A few times, we both stopped at the same moment, reacting to the same sound behind us. Each time there was nothing there. At the road crossing, we parted ways. He was heading into town. I wanted to keep moving. I watched him disappear down the side trail, then turned north again. The next few days blurred together. Nothing overt happened, but small things kept adding up. I would hear footsteps behind me that vanished when I stopped. I would find campsites that showed signs of recent use, but no one around. Once I found a fire pit that was still warm, but no smoke, no sound, no sign of who had used it. The final incident happened on a foggy morning. Visibility was low, the trail reduced to a narrow strip of dirt disappearing into gray. I heard someone walking ahead of me, steady and unhurried. I called out, thinking maybe I could catch up and hike together for a bit. The figure ahead slowed, but didn't turn around. As I closed the distance, I realized something was wrong. The person's gait was stiff, almost mechanical. Their pack hung strangely, too low, too loose. When they finally stopped and turned, I felt a wave of cold run through me. It was the man I had passed days earlier, the southbound hiker. Same beard, same clothes. But his face was wrong, blank, slack, eyes unfocused, as if he wasn't really seeing me at all. He opened his mouth like he was going to speak, then closed it again. After a moment, he turned back around and walked off the trail, straight into the trees, disappearing into the fog without a sound. I didn't follow. I didn't wait. I turned around and walked back to the road crossing as fast as my legs would carry me. When I reached town later that day, I told a ranger what I had experienced. He listened carefully, asked questions, and then said something I still think about. He told me they had found that southbound hiker's body 2 days earlier, miles from where I claimed to have seen him. Exposure, they said. No signs of struggle. I ended my hike early. Some people might say I overreacted. Maybe I did. But the Appalachian Trail isn't just a path through the woods. It's a place layered with history, loss, and long stretches where help is far away. Whatever had been walking near me out there, whatever I had seen in the fog, I was certain of one thing. It knew the trail better than I did, and it wasn't lost. I didn't start the Appalachian Trail looking for anything strange. I was trying to put distance between myself and a year that had left me exhausted in ways sleep didn't fix. The trail was supposed to be simple. Walk north, eat when hungry, sleep when tired, let the rest fall away. That's what everyone says, and for the first 2 weeks, it worked. The routine took over. Miles blurred together. Days became measured by elevation gain and water sources instead of time. The trouble began in a stretch of trail that locals rarely talked about, not because it was dangerous, but because it was unremarkable. No postcard views, no famous shelters, just long, wooded miles that felt strangely unchanged no matter how far you walked. The forest there didn't feel wild so much as maintained, like something that had learned how to look natural. I noticed the first odd detail when my GPS track stopped matching the trail. It wasn't dramatic. Just a subtle drift, like the map was slightly misaligned. I stopped, checked my phone, recalibrated. The trail marker nailed to a nearby tree showed the correct blaze. I assumed satellite error and kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I passed a shelter I hadn't planned to stop at. I recognized the name from my guidebook, but something felt off. The structure looked newer than expected. Fresh wood, no graffiti, no carved names. Even the logbook inside looked barely touched. Its pages crisp, the ink not yet smudged by humidity. Only 2 entries were written, both from the same week, both vague. One mentioned a restless night and strange dreams. The other simply said they wouldn't be staying again. I didn't linger. That night I camped alone, a few hundred feet off the trail. I followed leave no trace rules, chose a discreet spot, cooked quickly, and crawled into my tent as darkness settled. The forest sounds were normal at first. Insects, distant wind. Somewhere far off, an owl. Then gradually those sounds thinned out, not all at once, one by one, like switches being turned off. I lay there listening, telling myself it was normal. Weather changes, animals move, but the silence felt intentional, like something waiting for a response. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I remember was waking to pressure on the ground beside my tent. Not footsteps exactly, more like weight being shifted, testing the earth. I held still, barely breathing. The sound moved slowly, circling, stopping now and then as if listening for movement from inside. It never touched the tent. That was what unsettled me most. Whatever it was, it stayed just far enough away to avoid contact. By morning, there were no tracks. The soil was soft enough that I should have seen something. I packed up and left early, unsettled but unwilling to admit fear to myself. Over the next day, I began seeing things that didn't add up. A blaze painted too low on a tree, almost at knee height. A trail sign pointing in the wrong direction. A side path that appeared briefly on my map and then vanished. Each detail on its own meant nothing. Together they felt like breadcrumbs leading nowhere. Late in the afternoon, I caught up to another hiker. She was moving slowly, favoring one knee. We fell into conversation easily. Her name was Marissa. She had been on trail longer than I had and knew the area well. When I mentioned the shelter I'd passed, she frowned. She said she didn't remember one by that name in this section. I pulled out my guidebook and showed her. She stared at the page longer than necessary and finally said maybe it was newer than she thought. We decided to hike together for the evening. Shared miles go faster, and the sense of isolation faded with another person nearby. We camped close to the trail that night, separate tents but within speaking distance. Sometime after midnight, I woke to Marissa whispering my name. I answered quietly, asking what was wrong. She didn't respond. I unzipped my tent just enough to see her silhouette sitting upright, facing the trees. She didn't move. I asked again. Still nothing. I convinced myself she was sleepwalking. In the morning, she said she didn't remember waking up at all. We continued together another day. The forest grew denser, the trail narrower. My GPS continued to drift. At one point, we crossed the same fallen log twice within an hour, approaching it from opposite directions. We stopped and argued about it, both of us certain of what we'd seen. The argument ended when neither of us could explain how it was possible. That night, we reached another shelter. This one matched the guidebook description exactly. Old wood, carved names, a long list of logbook entries. I flipped through while Marissa set up her sleeping bag. About halfway through, I noticed something strange. Several entries mentioned hiking with a woman named Marissa. Same trail name, same injury, same personality notes. The dates spanned years. I showed her the book. She laughed at first, assuming coincidence. Then she read more carefully. The laughter faded. One entry described her knee injury in detail, down to the brand of brace she wore. She insisted it wasn't possible, said she had never hiked this section before. That night, neither of us slept well. I heard footsteps outside the shelter, slow and careful, stopping at the doorway but never entering. Marissa clutched her sleeping bag and stared at the entrance until morning. When daylight came, she was gone. Her pack was still there. Her shoes were still lined up neatly near the wall. No note, no sign of a struggle. I checked the logbook again, hoping for clarity. A new entry had been added overnight, written in cramped handwriting. It thanked me for hiking with her. I left the shelter immediately. I hiked hard, ignoring fatigue, ignoring hunger, driven by the need to reach a road crossing. The trail twisted unnaturally, looping back on itself, refusing to lead anywhere familiar. Several times I heard someone walking behind me, matching my pace exactly. I didn't turn around. By late afternoon, I broke out onto a gravel road I recognized from my map. Relief hit me so hard I had to sit down. A ranger station was a mile down the road. I made it there before dark and told them everything. They listened politely, took notes, asked questions. When I mentioned Marissa, the ranger exchanged a glance with his partner. He told me no one by that description had been reported missing recently. When I showed them a photo I'd taken of her earlier on the trail, they studied it in silence. Finally, the ranger said they had recovered remains in that section the previous spring. A solo female hiker, knee injury, died of exposure after becoming disoriented. Her name was Marissa. I left the trail the next morning. People talk about the Appalachian Trail like it's a line you follow from one place to another, but in some sections, it feels more like a loop, like the trail remembers the people who walk it, and sometimes it lets them walk again. I was never afraid of being alone on the Appalachian Trail. I had grown up hunting and camping in the mountains, and solitude was something I actively sought. What unsettled me was unpredictability, when patterns broke, when routines failed, when the land itself stopped behaving the way experience said it should. That was what made the section I hiked that fall impossible to forget. I entered the trail in late October, after peak season had passed. The crowds were gone, shelters were emptier, and daylight shortened quickly. I liked it that way. Fewer people meant fewer variables. I planned my days carefully, checked weather reports whenever I had signal, and kept my mileage conservative. There was no reason for anything to go wrong. The first sign that something was off came from my watch. I used a basic GPS watch to track distance and elevation. It wasn't fancy, but it was reliable. One afternoon, after hiking steadily for hours, I checked my progress and noticed the distance hadn't changed in nearly 20 minutes. I assumed it was a signal issue. I restarted the watch and kept going. 20 minutes later, the number was the same. I stopped, looked around, and tried to orient myself. The trail looked normal. Same packed dirt, same leaf litter, same gentle curve between hardwoods. I walked another 100 yards, stopped, and checked again. Still nothing. The elevation had changed, but the distance had not. I shut the watch off completely and put it away. Electronics fail. That was an easy explanation. That evening, I reached a shelter I hadn't planned to stay at. The light was fading fast, and the air had turned sharply cold. I decided to stop rather than push my luck. The shelter was empty, but signs of recent use were everywhere. A half-burned candle, a flattened sleeping pad mark, footprints pressed into the dirt floor. I read the logbook while eating dinner. Most entries were recent, mostly day hikers and section hikers. One entry caught my attention. It mentioned hikers becoming confused about mileage in that area, feeling like they weren't making progress even after long days. The writer joked about the trail stretching itself. I didn't laugh. That night, I slept poorly. Not because of noise, but because of the absence of it. Even deep in the mountains, there's usually something: wind, insects, the creak of trees. That night felt sealed off. The darkness pressed in so heavily that when I turned off my headlamp, it felt like closing my eyes underwater. Sometime in the night, I woke to the sound of someone whispering nearby. Not words I could understand, just breathy murmurs, like someone talking quietly to themselves. I sat up, listening. The sound moved, drifting from one side of the shelter to the other, then fading away into the woods. I didn't call out. I didn't turn on my light. I waited until morning. At dawn, I checked around the shelter. No footprints, no disturbed leaves. The ground was dry, but not hard enough to hide tracks completely. Whoever or whatever had been there had left nothing behind. I left early, uneasy but determined not to overthink it. As the day wore on, I began noticing landmarks repeating themselves. A twisted oak with a lightning scar, a boulder shaped like a seat, a small creek crossing with a fallen log bridge. I recognized each one, not because I had passed them recently, but because I had passed them earlier that same day. I stopped and pulled out my map. According to it, I should have been miles past that point. I checked the compass. The trail was heading north, just like it should. Everything aligned, except reality. That afternoon, I encountered another hiker. He came toward me from the north, which should have been impossible given my pace and timeline. He looked exhausted, more than trail fatigue could explain. His clothes were dirty, torn in places, and his eyes darted constantly, like he expected something to appear behind me. We exchanged greetings, but he didn't stop walking. He spoke while moving. His words rushed. He asked how long I had been in that section. When I told him, he shook his head and said that wasn't possible. He said he had been stuck there for days, hiking hard, but never reaching the next shelter. I asked him why he didn't leave the trail. He said he tried, but every side path led him back. Before I could respond, he stopped suddenly, stared past me, and went quiet. After a moment, he said he had to keep moving and stepped off the trail, disappearing into the trees without another word. I stood there for a long time, listening. I never heard him walk away. As daylight faded, I reached the same shelter I had slept in the night before. I knew it was the same shelter, the same carvings, the same logbook, the same half-burned candle, now burned lower. My stomach dropped. I flipped through the logbook. A new entry had been added, dated that morning. It described someone hiking north, confused about distance, convinced the trail was looping. It mentioned meeting another hiker who refused to believe him. The handwriting matched mine. I didn't remember writing it. Panic crept in slowly, cold and deliberate. I packed up immediately and left the shelter, even though night was coming fast. I didn't care where the trail led anymore. I just needed movement, change, something different. The forest darkened quickly. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the trees. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending in ways that made my depth perception unreliable. Several times, I felt like I was walking downhill while the trail clearly climbed. Then I heard footsteps behind me. They weren't rushing. They weren't trying to catch up. They stayed just far enough back to remain unseen, matching my pace exactly. When I stopped, they stopped. When I turned around, the beam of my light caught nothing but trees. After hours that felt far longer than they should have been, I saw lights ahead. Real lights, yellow and steady. A road. I nearly ran the last stretch. I stumbled onto the pavement, breathless and shaking. A car passed and slowed, the driver staring at me like I'd crawled out of the woods rather than walked. I didn't care. I flagged them down and asked where I was. They told me a town name I recognized. According to my map, it was 3 days south of where I had entered that section. I checked my watch. It now showed the correct distance again, as if nothing had happened. I never went back to that part of the trail. Rangers later told me no one else had reported issues. No missing hikers, no unusual activity. But I still dream about walking that corridor of trees, watching landmarks repeat, knowing I'm moving forward while going nowhere at all. The Appalachian Trail is a path meant to be walked, but some sections don't want you to leave. I didn't expect the worst part of my hike to come from something as ordinary as a shelter. Shelters on the Appalachian Trail are predictable places. You know what you're getting: rough wood, old carvings, mice, and the quiet understanding that strangers will share a roof for the night and then go their separate ways. That predictability is comforting when the rest of the world has narrowed down to dirt, trees, and miles. I had been hiking north for nearly a month when I reached a stretch known for long distances between road crossings. I planned carefully, checked weather windows, and made sure my food carried me a few extra days just in case. The section itself wasn't particularly hard. The elevation changes were moderate, the trail well maintained. Nothing about it should have stood out. The shelter I reached that evening was not on my original itinerary. I intended to push another 5 miles, but a sudden temperature drop and a stiff wind made the decision for me. By the time I arrived, dusk was already settling in, and the forest had taken on that muted gray tone that comes right before darkness fully sets in. The shelter was empty. That wasn't unusual. It was late in the season, and fewer hikers were passing through. Still, something about the place felt overly neat. No trash, no abandoned gear, no recent carvings. The floor was swept clean of leaves, and even the fire ring outside looked recently maintained. I told myself a trail crew must have come through recently. I cooked dinner, wrote a short entry in the logbook, and settled in for the night. The logbook entries before mine were sparse, spread out over several days. Most were unremarkable. One entry mentioned hearing movement nearby after midnight, but chalked it up to deer. Another said they felt uneasy and left early. I didn't dwell on it. Sometime after I fell asleep, I woke to the sound of someone climbing the steps. The shelter had wooden steps leading up from the trail. They creaked loudly under weight. I heard each step distinctly, slow and deliberate, as if whoever was climbing wanted to be heard. I assumed another hiker had arrived late and waited for them to announce themselves. They never did. The footsteps stopped at the top of the steps. I lay there listening, expecting the sound of a pack being dropped or a sleeping pad unrolled. Instead, nothing happened. The silence stretched long enough to make my skin crawl. Finally, I called out, asking who was there. No response. I turned on my headlamp and scanned the shelter. I was alone. The steps outside were empty. I stayed awake the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked around the shelter. The ground near the steps was soft enough to hold impressions, but there were no footprints, none leading toward the shelter, none leading away. The dirt looked undisturbed, as if no one had been there at all. I left early, unsettled but unwilling to jump to conclusions. The next shelter was only a half-day hike away. I reached it by early afternoon and found 2 other hikers there, both heading southbound. We talked for a while, exchanging information about trail conditions and water sources. Eventually, I mentioned the shelter from the night before and asked if they'd stayed there recently. One of them stiffened slightly. He said they had planned to, but changed their minds at the last minute. When I asked why, he hesitated, then said the place made him uncomfortable. Said it felt like someone was already there, even when it was empty. His friend added that they had heard footsteps on the trail nearby while they were still deciding whether to stop. Slow pacing sounds that stopped whenever they looked up. I didn't tell them about my experience. I didn't want to reinforce their fears or my own. That night passed without incident. The next day, I continued north, telling myself I was letting coincidence get the better of me. 2 days later, I reached another shelter. This one looked exactly like the first. Same layout, same steps, same carvings on the beams, down to the initials carved near the back corner. At first, I assumed shelters were standardized more than I realized, but the longer I looked, the more specific details matched. A split plank on the floor, a knot in the wood shaped like a hook. Even the fire ring sat in the same position relative to the shelter. I checked my map 3 times. According to it, this shelter was miles from the other, with different construction dates listed. Inside, the logbook sat in the same place. The entries were different, but the handwriting styles were familiar. One entry mentioned arriving late and hearing footsteps on the steps after midnight. Another said they woke to find someone standing just outside the shelter, facing inward, not moving. My hands shook slightly as I added my own entry, keeping it brief. That night, I stayed awake. Sometime after midnight, I heard the steps again. One step, then another, slow, heavy, intentional. They stopped at the top. I held my breath, listening. Then the footsteps moved again, but this time they didn't leave. They paced back and forth just outside the shelter opening, never crossing the threshold, never retreating. I could hear the faint scrape of boots on wood, the subtle shift of weight. After what felt like an hour, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep. In the morning, the logbook had a new entry. It was written beneath mine, dated overnight. It thanked me for staying quiet. I left immediately. Over the next several days, I noticed a pattern. Every shelter I stayed in shared similarities with the others. Not identical, but close enough to feel wrong. The same kinds of carvings, the same sense of being watched, the same footsteps at night. I tried camping away from shelters. The footsteps followed, always at a distance, always pacing, never approaching close enough to force confrontation. At a road crossing, I flagged down a passing hiker heading into town and asked if there were known issues in that section. He hesitated, then said rangers didn't talk about it much, but there were stories of someone who never used a tent, never slept inside, just moved from shelter to shelter, night after night. I asked if they were dangerous. He said no one knew. The final night happened at a shelter I hadn't planned to stop at. Exhaustion made the choice for me. I arrived late, barely enough light to see. The shelter was already occupied. A man sat inside, back against the wall, pack neatly arranged beside him. He looked up as I approached and nodded, expression neutral. He didn't introduce himself. I set up my space quietly. We exchanged a few polite words. His voice was flat, tired, but normal. Nothing about him seemed threatening. When night fell, he lay down and faced the wall. I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were inside the shelter. Slow steps moved across the wooden floor, stopping near my sleeping spot. I turned my headlamp on. The shelter was empty. No man, no pack, no gear. The logbook sat open. A new entry had been written. It mentioned sharing the shelter with someone new. It said it was good to finally be inside. I left the trail the next morning. Some hikers chase miles, some chase views. I chased answers for a long time after that hike and never found any. The Appalachian Trail is full of shelters meant to offer safety and rest, but some of them aren't waiting for hikers. They're waiting for someone who never left. I had volunteered with search and rescue before I ever set foot on the Appalachian Trail as a hiker. Not officially at first, just helping local teams when they were short-handed. Later, after I had more experience, I went through proper training and became part of a regional group that responded to missing hikers, lost hunters, and occasional medical emergencies. Most calls were routine. People underestimate weather, overestimate stamina, or miss a turn and panic. The mountains correct those mistakes quickly, but usually without malice. The case that ended my involvement with the trail was not routine. The call came in early October, after the first cold snap but before snowfall. A solo hiker had missed a scheduled check-in with family. His last known location was a section of trail known for long distances between shelters and poor cell coverage. Nothing unusual on its own. Happens every year. What made it different was how long it took us to find anything at all. We assembled at a trailhead just after sunrise. 7 of us split into 2 teams. Weather was clear, visibility good. The plan was simple. Follow the trail north and south from the last known point, check side paths, campsites, water sources. Standard procedure. The first oddity was the backpack. One of the volunteers spotted it less than a mile from the trailhead, sitting upright against a tree just off the trail. Not hidden, not discarded carelessly. Placed. The pack was fully loaded, food, water, gear, even a jacket folded neatly on top. The only things missing were the hiker himself and his boots. Boots are not something people abandon. We logged the find, marked coordinates, and continued. No footprints led away from the pack. The soil was soft enough to show impressions clearly, but there was nothing. It was as if the hiker had been removed from the scene rather than leaving it. We expanded the search area. Over the next several hours, we found more items. A trekking pole leaned against a rock, a water bottle standing upright beside the trail, a headlamp placed on a tree stump, turned off, battery still full. Each item appeared intentionally set down, spaced out along a half-mile stretch. Still no tracks. The team leader called it in. We were told to slow down, document everything, and stay alert. That was when we started hearing movement. At first it was subtle, branches shifting behind us, leaves crunching just out of sight. We assumed it was wildlife reacting to our presence. That explanation held until the sounds began matching our movements. When we stopped, the sounds stopped. When we moved, they resumed. Always behind us, never ahead, never close enough to see. We finished the first day without locating the hiker. As daylight faded, Command ordered us to regroup at a nearby shelter and continue at first light. None of us liked the idea, but protocol mattered. The shelter was empty when we arrived. We set up lights, ate quickly, and reviewed notes. One volunteer mentioned feeling watched. Another said he thought he heard someone walking around the shelter while he was collecting water. No one wanted to escalate it, but the tension was obvious. I took first watch. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the trail, not approaching the shelter, just pacing nearby, back and forth, slow and steady. I shined my flashlight into the trees. Nothing reflected back. The sound stopped. 10 minutes later, it resumed. By morning, everyone was exhausted. We resumed the search at dawn. Less than a mile from the shelter, we found the boots. They were placed side by side on the trail, toes pointing north, laces neatly tucked inside. No socks inside, no blood, no signs of damage. The hikers' feet had not walked out of them. Command escalated the search. More volunteers were dispatched. A helicopter did an overhead sweep later that afternoon and reported nothing unusual. No heat signatures, no movement. That evening, one of the newer volunteers asked a question no one wanted to answer. Why were the items placed where we would find them? There was no answer. On the third day, we found footprints. Not human, not animal. They were deep impressions in the soil, long and narrow, spaced evenly like a person walking, but the shape was wrong. No defined heel, no toe separation, just smooth depressions, as if something heavy pressed down without a foot. They followed the trail north. We followed them. The footprints led us to a narrow section where the trail ran along a slope. Trees grew close on either side, limiting visibility. Halfway through, the prints stopped. In the middle of the trail, no indication of turning, no signs of climbing or descending, just an abrupt end. That was when we heard the voice. It came from behind us, calling the missing hiker's name, perfectly pronounced. Calm, familiar. One volunteer turned instinctively. I grabbed his arm before he could step off the trail. The voice repeated the name again, closer this time. We called out, demanding identification. The voice responded by listing details from the hiker's intake form. Age, home state, trail name, even the emergency contact. It knew things only paperwork would reveal. Command ordered immediate withdrawal. We returned to the shelter under escort. No one spoke much. That night, no one slept. We heard movement circling the shelter until dawn, sometimes stopping close enough that we could hear breathing, but never entering. The official report concluded that the hiker likely succumbed to exposure and that animals scattered his gear. The case was closed within a month. Unofficially, every volunteer involved quit. I left the trail entirely. Years later, I received an email from a new volunteer asking about that case. They said another hiker had gone missing in the same section. Gear found, boots placed neatly, no tracks. The email ended with a question. Had we ever heard it speak? I didn't reply. Somewhere along the Appalachian Trail, something has learned how hikers work, how we move, how we search, how we call out names when we're lost. And it doesn't rush. It just waits for the trail to give it another one. I wasn't hiking the Appalachian Trail for leisure that year. I was part of a volunteer trail maintenance crew assigned to a long, underused section that had been getting complaints. Blazes were fading, drainage was poor in spots, a few footbridges needed inspection before winter set in. It wasn't glamorous work, but it mattered. The trail doesn't maintain itself, and neglect shows faster than people realize. Our crew consisted of 4 people, all experienced, all familiar with backcountry protocol. We planned to work a 5-day stretch, camping near our assigned sections and moving steadily north. Radios worked intermittently, but that wasn't unusual. We logged our positions every evening and stuck closely to schedule. The first 2 days went smoothly. On the third morning, we noticed something odd about the blazes. They weren't faded anymore. We had marked several trees the day before as needing repainting. We were sure of it. We'd taken notes, snapped photos, even joked about how old some of the markings were. That morning when we reached the first of those trees, the blaze was bright white, sharp-edged, and fresh. too fresh. At first, we assumed another crew had come through overnight. That explanation didn't hold up. No one had logged activity in that section. No one would repaint without coordinating, especially that quickly. We checked the others. Same thing. Every blaze we had flagged was now pristine. We didn't repaint anything that day. By afternoon, one of the crew members, Dan, pointed out something else. The spacing between blazes felt wrong, subtle, but noticeable if you worked trails long enough. They were closer together than standard, as if whoever painted them wanted to ensure no one ever lost the path. That night, we camped near a junction where an old side trail branched off. According to maps, it was no longer maintained and officially discouraged. We planned to inspect the signage in the morning. After dark, I heard footsteps on the trail, not wandering, not hesitant, confident, purposeful. I assumed it was Dan or one of the others making a late trip to the tree line. I called out, asking who it was. The footsteps stopped. No response. When I shined my headlamp toward the trail, the beam caught the blazes glowing unnaturally bright against the dark bark. They seemed closer together than they had earlier that day. None of us slept well. In the morning, the junction sign was gone, not broken, not damaged, removed cleanly as if it had never been there. The side trail itself looked different too. More defined, cleared, walked. Someone had been using it. We debated whether to follow it. Officially, we shouldn't have. But part of our job was inspection, and ignoring an active path felt irresponsible. We agreed to walk a short distance in, document what we saw, and turn back. The blazes along that side trail were flawless, white, fresh, perfectly spaced, too perfect. After half a mile, we realized the forest had gone quiet. No insects, no birds. Even the wind seemed to avoid that corridor. The trail itself dipped slightly, then leveled out into a stretch that felt wrong underfoot. The dirt was compacted, smooth, almost polished. Dan stopped suddenly and pointed ahead. Someone was walking toward us. They wore neutral outdoor clothing, no pack, no tools, no visible insignia. They walked the trail like they owned it, posture upright, pace steady. When they reached us, they stopped and looked at each of us in turn. Then they spoke. They asked what our assignment was, not who we were, not how we were doing. Our assignment. I answered honestly, explaining our maintenance work, our planned route, our timeline. The person listened without reacting. When I finished, they nodded once and said we were outside our designated section. I told them the maps didn't show this trail as active. They said the trail was active. They said it had always been active. They asked us to turn around. There was no threat in their voice, no hostility, just certainty. We did as they asked. When we reached our main trail again, the side path was gone. No junction, no sign, no disturbed ground, just continuous forest. That afternoon, we found our work undone. Drainage ditches we had cleared were filled in. Logs we had removed were back in place. Even our boot prints from the previous day were gone, replaced by smooth, undisturbed soil. The trail was correcting itself. That night, we heard movement again, not random, organized. Multiple sets of footsteps moving along the trail, stopping at blazes, continuing, pausing, always on the trail, never entering our camp. In the morning, one of our crew members was gone. Her tent was still there, her gear untouched, no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away. Only one thing had changed. A new blaze had been painted on a tree near where her tent stood, closer to the ground than the others. We called for evacuation. The radio worked perfectly for the first time all week. Search teams later found her 3 miles north, walking steadily along the trail. No injuries, no confusion. She said she had been reassigned and was just following instructions. She couldn't say who gave them. She was removed from the trail and placed under medical observation. She never volunteered again. Neither did I. The official report blamed fatigue, stress, and miscommunication. The section was temporarily closed for maintenance review. When it reopened, hikers praised how clear and easy to follow it was. I still think about that person we met on the side trail, about the way they spoke, like authority wasn't something they needed to explain. The Appalachian Trail is maintained by volunteers, but somewhere along it, something else is making sure people stay where they're supposed to be. And it does not like unscheduled changes. I have always kept a journal when I hike. Not a poetic one, not something meant for anyone else to read. Just dates, mileage, weather, shelter names, small notes about injuries or gear issues. On long trails, memory blurs faster than people realize, and writing things down keeps the days from sliding together. That habit probably saved me, even if I didn't realize it at the time. I started that section of the Appalachian Trail in early September, when the crowds thin out but conditions are still manageable. I wasn't rushing. I had no deadline, no reason to push past comfort. My plan was to hike steadily, stop at shelters when it made sense, and keep my routine tight. The first few days were uneventful. Good weather, decent miles, nothing worth writing more than numbers and short comments. Then, on the fourth day, I noticed a gap. I flipped back through my journal while taking a break and realized there was an entire day missing. No entry, no mileage, no notes. I assumed I had simply forgotten to write that night. It happens. I filled in what I could remember and moved on. That night, I stayed at a shelter with two other hikers. We cooked together, talked casually, exchanged trail names. One of them was a man in his 30s, friendly but quiet. The other was a woman a bit older than me, sharp and observant. We all signed the shelter register before bed. I remember that clearly because the man joked about how full the logbook was getting. Sometime during the night, I woke up disoriented. Not frightened, just confused. The shelter felt wrong, like I was somewhere unfamiliar despite knowing exactly where I was. I sat up and waited for the feeling to pass. In the morning, the shelter was empty. No gear, no packs, no sign anyone else had slept there. The register lay open on the bench where we'd left it. I flipped back to the previous night's page. Only my name was there. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to convince myself I had imagined the other hikers. That explanation didn't hold. I still remembered their faces, their voices, details that don't come from imagination. I checked my journal. The entry from the previous day had changed. It no longer mentioned hiking with anyone. I didn't like that, but I told myself exhaustion was doing strange things to my memory. Long-distance hiking messes with perception. I packed up and left. Over the next few days, small inconsistencies kept appearing. A shelter I remembered staying at didn't appear in my notes. A creek crossing I clearly recalled wasn't marked on my map. My journal entries felt thinner, like details were being shaved away. At one point, I passed a hiker heading southbound who greeted me by name. Not my trail name, my actual name. I asked how he knew it. He looked confused and said we had camped together 2 nights earlier. I told him that wasn't possible. He checked his own journal and showed me the entry. My name was there, written in his handwriting, alongside details about me that were accurate. When I checked my journal again later that day, the entry describing that date had vanished completely. That night, I stayed at another shelter. I was alone when I arrived, but the register showed several recent entries. One stood out. It described hiking with a man who slowly stopped responding over the course of a day. Not sick, not injured, just quieter, less present, like his attention was drifting away from the world. By evening, the writer said the man had walked past the shelter without stopping and never responded when called. The writer couldn't remember the man's name. I slept poorly. The next day, I felt wrong in a way that was hard to define. Not ill, not injured, just lighter, like something had been removed and I hadn't noticed when it happened. I checked my journal repeatedly, reassuring myself that my name was still there, that my handwriting was still mine. In the afternoon, I passed a trail register mounted near a road crossing. I flipped through it out of habit. My name appeared several times. Some entries described meeting me days before I had entered that section. Others mentioned hiking alongside me and feeling unsettled afterward, like they couldn't remember conversations we'd had moments earlier. One entry stopped me cold. It said I had walked into the woods without my pack and never returned. I checked the date. It was tomorrow. I left the trail at that road crossing and stayed in a motel that night. I locked the door, spread my journal out on the bed, and read every page carefully. Some entries felt unfamiliar, like they had been written by someone who knew my routines but not my thoughts. In the morning, one more page was missing. I ended my hike that day. Later, after I was home, I searched for information. Missing hikers, unidentified remains, stories that never made headlines. I found a pattern that chilled me more than any single event. People weren't vanishing physically at first. They were being forgotten, Trail registers stopped mentioning them. Journals lost their names. Other hikers remembered walking with someone but couldn't recall details. Eventually, even official reports referred to an unknown hiker. The trail didn't erase bodies, it erased presence. I still keep my journal. I still write every day. Sometimes I check old entries and find sentences I don't remember writing, but my name is still there. For now. I learned early on that water controls everything on the Appalachian Trail. You can push miles on bad legs, you can ration food, you can endure bad weather for a while, but water decides where you stop, how long you stay, and whether you survive a mistake. Experienced hikers don't wander randomly looking for it. We follow marked sources, springs listed in guides, creeks passed down through word of mouth. Those places become fixed points of trust in a landscape that otherwise keeps changing. That trust is what nearly killed me. I entered that section of trail in late summer during a dry spell. Several springs were already reported as low, and everyone was talking about one particular water source that never failed. It wasn't spectacular, just a small spring-fed pool, a short distance downhill from the trail, shaded by rock and roots. According to hikers coming southbound, it flowed even during drought years. I planned my days around it. The first night I stayed nearby, everything seemed normal. The path to the water was narrow but well-worn, clearly used. The pool itself was shallow but clean, water seeping steadily from the rock face. I filled my bottles, treated the water, and left without thinking twice. The second day, I camped farther north and didn't think about the spring at all. On the third day, I reached another dry stretch and needed water again. My guide listed the same spring, this time from the opposite direction. When I reached the trail junction that marked the side path, I hesitated. The path looked slightly different. Not drastically, just narrower, less disturbed. The rocks bordering it were cleaner, as if fewer boots had scraped against them. I assumed recent rain or maintenance and followed it down. The spring was there, the pool looked the same rock face, same roots snaking into the soil, same steady trickle of water. But the area felt colder, not temperature-wise, but in the way sound carried differently. My footsteps sounded duller, like they were being absorbed by the ground. I filled my bottles and noticed something odd. There were no insects. Normally, water sources buzz with life. Mosquitoes, flies, something. This place was silent. No ripples on the surface except where the water entered. No movement in the shadows. I left quickly. That night, I dreamed of drinking water and never feeling full. The next day, my thirst was worse than it should have been. I had rationed properly. My intake was fine. Still, my mouth felt dry, my tongue thick. I chalked it up to heat and kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the same spring again. That was impossible. According to my mileage, I should have been miles past it. I checked my map, checked my watch. Everything said I was exactly where I should be, except the spring shouldn't have been there. The side path was identical to the one I remembered. Same rocks, same bend, same slope. I told myself there were two similar springs close together. That explanation barely held, but it was better than the alternative. This time I noticed footprints near the pool. Bare footprints. They weren't human. Too long, too narrow, no clear toe impressions. Just smooth depressions pressed into the mud, leading to the water and stopping there. None leading away. I didn't drink. I backed away slowly and returned to the trail, my heart racing. That night I camped farther away than planned, ignoring my thirst. Sometime before dawn, I heard movement. Not footsteps, not animals. The sound of water being disturbed, slow splashes. Careful, as if someone was kneeling and standing repeatedly. I didn't sleep again. The next morning, my water was nearly gone. I needed a reliable source, and my guide showed one only a mile ahead. When I reached it, my stomach dropped. It was the same spring. Same rock face, same pool, same roots. This time, something was standing at the edge. At first, I thought it was a hiker crouched low, filtering water. Then it straightened slightly, and I realized the proportions were wrong. Too tall, arms too long. The way it moved was deliberate but unfamiliar, like it had learned the motions by watching. It didn't turn toward me. It stayed focused on the water, dipping its hands in and lifting them slowly, letting the liquid run off its fingers. I realized with a jolt that it wasn't drinking, it was rinsing its hands, as if preparing. I stepped back and a stone rolled under my boot. The thing froze. The silence was absolute. Even the trickle of water seemed to pause. Then it spoke. Not words at first, just a sound, wet and strained, like someone trying to remember how language worked. After a moment, it tried again. It said my trail name. Perfectly. I ran. I didn't stop running until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they would split. When I finally collapsed on the trail, I realized something worse than fear had settled in. I was out of water. I walked for hours, my throat raw, my head pounding. Every sound of moving water sent panic through me. Each time I followed it, the trail bent just enough to reveal the same spring, always the same. Sometimes empty, sometimes disturbed. Once, I saw wet footprints leading up the side path, stopping just short of the trail itself. By evening, my thoughts were slowing. Dehydration does that. Judgment slips, fear becomes quieter, replaced by a dull need. I followed the path down again. The thing was waiting. This time, it stood fully upright. I could see its shape clearly now. Tall, thin, skin stretched tight in places, darker around the hands and mouth as if perpetually damp. Its eyes reflected light oddly, not like an animal, not like a person. It held out its hands toward me. Water dripped from its fingers. It spoke again, clearer this time. It said the water was safe. It said everyone drinks eventually. I don't remember deciding to attack it. I only remember lunging forward, swinging my trekking pole with everything I had left. The pole struck its arm and the sound it made was wrong, hollow, like hitting wet wood. It recoiled, not in pain but surprise. That hesitation saved me. I stumbled past it, scrambling up the side path, tearing my hands on roots and rock. I don't know how long I ran after that. Hours, maybe. I remember collapsing near a road crossing and being found by a day hiker who gave me water and called for help. I was hospitalized for severe dehydration. I told the rangers about the spring. They checked the area. They told me there was no water source there. No side path, no pool, no rock face, just dry forest. Weeks later, I looked through online forums out of morbid curiosity. I found scattered posts from hikers describing an extra spring that appeared when conditions were dry. Some said it saved their hike. Others said it made them feel worse after drinking. A few posts ended abruptly. I no longer hike sections where water is scarce, because something out there has learned the one truth every hiker depends on. We will always come back to drink. I didn't set out on the Appalachian Trail to document anything unusual. Photography was just a way to pass the time and give my hikes some structure. I carried a small mirrorless camera with a lightweight lens. Nothing fancy, nothing professional. I liked capturing shelters at dawn, fog in the valleys, long stretches of empty trail that felt suspended outside of time. The photos were for me, not social media. I rarely even shared them. That habit almost convinced me I was imagining things. I entered that section of trail in mid-October, when the leaves were already turning and daylight shortened fast. The weather was cooperative, cool but stable, and the trail was quiet without being abandoned. I passed a handful of hikers each day, exchanged brief conversations, then continued on alone. Everything felt normal. The first strange photograph happened on my second day. I had stopped at a viewpoint just off the trail, a rocky outcrop overlooking a shallow valley. Fog hung low among the trees, moving slowly, reshaping the landscape every few minutes. I took several photos, adjusting exposure and focus, then packed up and moved on. That evening, while reviewing images in my tent, I noticed something odd in one of the frames. Near the bottom edge of the photo, partially obscured by fog, was a dark vertical shape. Too straight to be a tree, too uniform to be shadow. It stood where I was certain there had been nothing when I took the shot. I zoomed in. The resolution broke down before I could make out details, but the shape remained distinct, upright, narrow, human-sized. I told myself it was fog distortion, maybe a trick of contrast. I deleted the photo and went to sleep. The next day, I photographed a shelter from the trail approach. It was empty when I arrived, no gear inside, no footprints nearby. I took a wide shot of the structure framed by trees, then went about setting up camp nearby. That night, I checked the photo. There was someone standing inside the shelter. Not blurred, not shadowed. A clear figure standing at the back wall, facing outward. No pack, no visible features. Just a person-shaped absence where light should have been. I checked the metadata. The timestamp matched when I had arrived. I checked the rest of the shots from that sequence. The figure appeared in all of them, never moving, never changing posture. I hadn't seen anyone. I didn't delete those photos. Over the next few days, I became more careful with my camera. I stopped shooting casually. When I did take photos, I double-checked my surroundings, making sure no one was nearby. And still, things kept appearing. A figure standing just off the trail in the background of a creek crossing shot. A silhouette reflected faintly in the surface of a puddle where no one had been standing. Once, a shape partially hidden behind a tree trunk, positioned too deliberately to be coincidence. Always at a distance. Always just outside my direct line of sight. Never visible in person. I told no one. Saying it out loud would have made it real in a way I wasn't ready to accept. The fourth night, I stayed at a shelter with 2 other hikers. We talked briefly, exchanged names, then settled in. I didn't take photos that evening. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of fabric shifting. One of the hikers was sitting up, staring toward the shelter entrance. I asked quietly if something was wrong. He didn't answer. In the morning, he said he didn't remember waking up. Before we left, I took one photo of the shelter interior, partly out of habit, partly out of curiosity. Later that day, I checked the image. There were 4 people in the frame. The extra figure stood behind us, slightly out of focus, its outline sharper than it should have been given the lighting. It was close enough that it should have been seen. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying the camera. I showed the photo to one of the hikers. He stared at it for a long time and then handed the camera back without saying a word. He left the trail at the next road crossing. After that, the figure began appearing closer. In one photo, it stood at the edge of my campsite. In another, it was reflected faintly in my camera lens, distorted but unmistakable. I stopped photographing entirely, afraid of what I might capture next. That didn't stop it. That night, I heard breathing outside my tent, slow, controlled, close enough that I could hear moisture in each inhale. I held my breath, listening, waiting for movement. Nothing touched the tent. In the morning, I found footprints near my campsite. They were mine, except they weren't. The tread pattern matched my boots, but the spacing was wrong. Too even, too precise, as if someone had studied my gait and replicated it perfectly. The prints led a short distance away and stopped abruptly. I reached a road crossing the next afternoon and debated leaving the trail. Pride kept me going, so did curiosity. I needed to understand what was happening, needed proof that didn't rely solely on my perception. Against my better judgment, I took one last photo that evening. I set the camera on a rock, pointed it toward the trail, and used the timer. I stood in frame, pack on, trees behind me. When I checked the image, my stomach dropped. The figure stood directly behind me, close enough that its chest almost touched my back. Its features were clearer than ever. The outline of a face, dark hollows where eyes should have been, a mouth slightly open, as if mid-breath. Its hands rested at its sides. It wasn't reaching for me. It was posing. I dropped the camera and ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road and flagged down a passing car. I ended my hike that night. Weeks later, after I was home, I pulled the camera out again. I needed to know if the photos were still there, if it had been stress, fatigue, dehydration, anything explainable. Every image was intact, except the last one. The photo of me on the trail was gone. In its place was a new image. The trail was empty. Centered in the frame, standing alone, was the figure. Facing the camera, holding my camera. I deleted everything, wiped the card, sold the camera. I still hike occasionally, but I don't take photos anymore. Some things don't want to be remembered. They want evidence. And once you give it to them, they no longer need you in the frame.